She counted the $10 bills each evening, not because she needed them for survival, but because she was documenting every penny of the humiliation as evidence of how completely her billionaire husband had misunderstood the woman he was kicking out. He thought he was being generous when he handed her daily cash before returning to his mistress's arms, completely unaware that the pregnant wife he'd discarded had secretly built a trillion-dollar empire while he was too distracted by forbidden passion to notice. The irony was almost poetic. While he was planning his second wedding, she was finalizing the purchase of his family company, the very business his mother had lorded over at every company party, using those gatherings as opportunities to mock the simple woman her son had married before finding someone more suitable. His mother's cruelty had been legendary at those parties, her sharp tongue reducing grown executives to shame, but her favorite target had always been her own daughter-in-law, the pregnant woman she assumed was trapped and helpless. When the next company party arrived, the billionaire brought his mistress as his official date. His mother prepared her cruelest mockery yet, and the entire executive board had no idea they were now working for the woman standing quietly in the corner in her maternity dress. What the secret trillionaire did when his mother launched her attack didn't just expose the truth. It crushed the billionaire so thoroughly that he would never recover, shattered his mother's entire worldview, and left his mistress staring at the man she'd won and realizing she'd actually lost. Could a man who traded his pregnant wife for $10 a day ever comprehend the magnitude of his mistake? Would his mother's decades of cruelty finally catch up with her in one devastating moment? And would the mistress stay for poverty after she'd only signed up for wealth? In this story, you'll learn how quiet strength always defeats loud arrogance, and how patience becomes the sharpest weapon when wielded correctly. You'll learn that people who underestimate you are handing you power they don't realize exists, and that documenting cruelty gives you evidence when words alone won't work. Most importantly, you'll discover that true character reveals itself not in how people treat the powerful, but in how they treat those they believe are powerless. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is actually the one holding all the cards, waiting for the perfect moment to show the world what real power looks like. Elena Martinez sat at the kitchen island of what had been her home for 7 years, spreading the $10 bills across the marble surface like a prosecutor arranging evidence for a murder trial. Each bill represented a day of her pregnancy, a day of her husband's calculated cruelty, but more importantly, each bill represented a piece of documentation that would eventually tell the story of how billionaire James Wellington had underestimated the most dangerous person he'd ever met. The evening sun cast long shadows across the bills, and she photographed them methodically with her phone, adding the image to a folder she'd labeled simply Evidence of Character. Though the lawyers at Morrison & Associates, the most feared litigation firm in Manhattan, had suggested something more technical when she'd retained them 3 months ago. "Another $10, Elena," James had said that morning, tossing the bill onto the breakfast table where she'd been reviewing acquisition documents on her laptop. Documents he'd assumed were pregnancy blogs or baby registries because he'd stopped actually looking at her 6 months ago when Vanessa Pierce had walked into his life wearing a red dress and ambition that matched his own. That should cover your expenses for the day, right? I mean, you're not exactly going anywhere in your condition. Her condition, that's what he called the pregnancy now, as if their child was a medical problem rather than a person. But Elena had simply smiled and folded the $10 bill into her wallet alongside the previous 67 bills, each one a data point in the case she was building. She'd learned long ago that silence was the most powerful weapon a woman could wield, especially when that woman had been quietly building a financial empire that now exceeded $3 trillion while her husband was too busy texting his mistress under the dinner table to notice. The irony wasn't lost on her that James Wellington, the man who'd inherited Wellington Industries from his grandfather and believed himself a self-made billionaire, despite never having started anything from scratch, was currently bragging to Vanessa about his business acumen, while Elena had just finalized the purchase of his family company through a network of shell corporations so complex that even his own board had recommended accepting the generous offer from Prometheus Holdings. James didn't know that Prometheus was Greek for forethought, and he certainly didn't know that the holding company's primary shareholder was the pregnant wife he was kicking out to make room for his mistress. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Richard Chen, her lead attorney. The final paperwork cleared. You now own 73% of Wellington Industries. The remaining 27% is scattered among small shareholders who will vote however the majority shareholder directs. Congratulations, Mrs. Wellington. You're now your husband's boss. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick as if celebrating the acquisition. But the satisfaction was tempered by the memory of how she'd gotten here. 7 years ago, she'd been Elena Rodriguez, a venture capitalist who'd made her first $100 million by age 25 by betting on tech startups that everyone else had dismissed. She'd met James at a charity gala where he'd been the keynote speaker, talking about family legacy and building something that lasted. And she'd believed every word because she'd wanted to believe that wealth and character could coexist in the same person. But wealth, she'd learned, often insulated people from the consequences that built character. And James Wellington had never faced a consequence in his life until now. The wedding to Vanessa was scheduled for next month, a spring ceremony in the Hamptons that would cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, though significantly less than the $10 per day James thought was adequate support for his pregnant wife. Elena had received the invitation yesterday, delivered by mistake to the apartment James had rented for her in a building he considered suitable for her current circumstances, and she'd added it to her evidence folder alongside the photographs of the $10 bills. The text messages she'd recovered from the cloud backup James didn't know she could access, and the financial records showing that Wellington Industries was actually hemorrhaging money while James was too distracted by his affair to notice. The company party was in 3 days, the annual spring gala, where Wellington Industries celebrated another year of what James believed was success, though the actual numbers told a different story. His mother, Patricia Wellington, had already sent Elena a message making it clear she wasn't welcome, but the message had been sent to Elena's old email address, and Patricia didn't know that the woman she'd spent 7 years mocking at every company gathering was now the person who controlled whether Wellington Industries survived or collapsed. Elena photographed the invitation next to the $10 bills, creating a composition that told the entire story without words, and sent the image to Richard with a simple message. See you at the party. Patricia Wellington had been preparing for company parties the way military generals prepared for invasions, with strategic precision, careful target selection, and an unwavering belief in her own superiority. For 43 years, she'd ruled Wellington Industries from behind the scenes, never holding an official title, but wielding more power than any executive on the payroll through the simple mechanism of being the matriarch who transformed her husband's modest construction business into a billion-dollar empire before his death. The spring gala was her arena, the place where she reminded everyone exactly who had built the kingdom they all served. But this year's event carried special significance because she'd finally convinced her son to discard the inadequate woman who trapped him with a pregnancy and embrace Vanessa Pierce, a woman Patricia considered worthy of the Wellington name. The caterers need to understand that we're expecting 300 guests, not the usual 250, Patricia told her assistant, reviewing the seating chart in her penthouse office that overlooked the city her family had helped build. And make sure Elena Martinez isn't on the list. I don't care what her legal status is. She's no longer family, and I won't have her condition disrupting the evening when James introduces Vanessa as his fiancée. But what Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew except the senior partners at Morrison & Associates and the board members who'd signed the acquisition documents, was that Elena Martinez wasn't just on the guest list, she was technically the host, given that Prometheus Holdings now owned the company, the building, and even the penthouse office where Patricia was currently planning her daughter-in-law's final humiliation. James Wellington sat in his corner office 3 floors below his mother's penthouse, reviewing the quarterly reports that should have alarmed him but didn't because he'd learned to interpret bad news as temporary setbacks rather than warning signs of systemic failure. Wellington Industries had been losing market share for 2 years, bleeding contracts to competitors who'd invested in innovation while James had been investing in his relationship with Vanessa. But the sale of the company to Prometheus Holdings had injected enough capital to make the problem seem manageable. The new owners haven't requested any meetings yet, his CFO, Robert Torres, said during their morning briefing, his tone suggesting this was good news rather than the ominous silence it actually represented. The acquisition agreement gives them majority control, but maintains current management structure. You're still CEO, your mother still has her advisory role, and operations continue as normal. Exactly as it should be, James replied, signing off on expense reports that included the rental apartment for Elena, a line item he'd instructed accounting to categorize as charitable contributions because it made him feel magnanimous rather than obligated. The Wellington name still means something in the city. These corporate raiders come in, extract their profit, and move on. We just need to maintain appearances until they lose interest. But appearances were exactly what Elena had been studying for 7 years, documenting the gap between the Wellington family's public image and their private character with the thoroughness of an anthropologist studying a dying civilization. She'd attended every company party, smiled through every one of Patricia's pointed comments about her humble background and fortunate marriage, and cataloged every moment when the family's cruelty was disguised as sophistication. The flashback hit James unexpectedly during his lunch meeting with Vanessa at the restaurant where they'd first met. The place where their affair had begun 18 months ago when Elena had been in her first trimester, exhausted and nauseous but still trying to be the wife James had claimed to want. Vanessa had been a consultant hired to streamline operations, which had meant identifying which employees to terminate to improve profit margins, and James had been drawn to her efficiency, her lack of sentimentality, her willingness to make hard decisions without the emotional complications Elena brought to everything. "Your mother wants me to wear the Wellington pearls to the gala," Vanessa said, displaying a photograph on her phone of the family heirloom Patricia had never offered to Elena, despite 7 years of marriage. "She says it'll make the right statement about family continuity." James looked at the pearls, the same ones his grandmother had worn, the ones his mother had promised would go to his wife, the ones Elena had admired in family photographs but never been allowed to touch, and felt the first flutter of something that might have been guilt but was too unfamiliar to identify correctly. Elena had never asked for the pearls, never demanded the tokens of acceptance that Vanessa was receiving after 18 months of what James still couldn't quite call a relationship without feeling the weight of the word affair. "She'll love them on you," James said, pushing away the image of Elena at their wedding, wearing the simple strand of pearls she'd purchased herself because his mother had claimed the family pearls were being cleaned that week. "You deserve them." But deserve was a concept that was about to be redefined in ways that would shatter James Wellington's understanding of justice, karma, and the catastrophic consequences of confusing patience with weakness. Vanessa smiled and kissed him, tasting like champagne and victory, completely unaware that the woman they'd defeated was actually the woman who now controlled whether they'd still be celebrating at next year's gala. Across town, Elena stood in her apartment, the one James considered adequate for her condition, reviewing the seating chart for the gala that her legal team had acquired through their new ownership rights. She'd been assigned to table 17 in the back corner near the kitchen doors, the traditional location for employees plus ones and people who weren't important enough to see the stage clearly. But Elena had other plans for where she'd be sitting, and those plans included a position where Patricia Wellington would have no choice but to see exactly who she'd been mocking for 7 years, and where James Wellington would have no choice but to watch his entire world collapse in the space of a single evening. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick again, and whispered, "Your grandmother doesn't know it yet, but she just invited us to our own company party." The Wellington Industries Spring Gala transformed the Metropolitan Ballroom into a temple of wealth and legacy, crystal chandeliers casting light across 300 guests who represented the intersection of old money and new power. Patricia Wellington stood at the entrance in a gown that cost more than Elena's monthly apartment rent, greeting guests with the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making people feel simultaneously welcomed and evaluated. James stood beside her with Vanessa on his arm, the family pearls glowing against Vanessa's neck like a declaration of conquest. But neither of them noticed when Elena Martinez entered through the main doors, wearing a custom maternity gown that somehow made her pregnancy look like power rather than vulnerability. "Table 17 is in the back," the hostess said, checking her list with the apologetic tone of someone delivering news about a downgrade. But Elena simply smiled and accepted the table card before making her way through the crowd with the unhurried grace of someone who knew the evening would eventually come to her. She'd spent 3 hours that afternoon with her legal team, reviewing not just the ownership documents, but the carefully constructed plan for how the revelation would unfold. Richard Chen had wanted something dramatic, a public announcement, perhaps a video presentation, but Elena had insisted on something more personal, more poetic, more devastating. She wanted Patricia Wellington to perform her cruelty one last time before learning that her audience had become her judge. The dinner proceeded exactly as Patricia had orchestrated it. Courses timed perfectly, speeches calibrated to celebrate the Wellington legacy, and a carefully planned moment after the main course when Patricia would take the microphone to discuss family values and the importance of choosing partners who elevate rather than diminish our standards. Elena had read the speech notes that her legal team had accessed through their new ownership rights, and she'd marveled at how Patricia had managed to write an entire address about proper partnership without ever mentioning Elena by name, while making it abundantly clear who she was discussing. At table 17, Elena sat beside junior executives who clearly didn't know who she was, but were kind enough to include her in their conversation about office politics and speculation about the new owners. "I heard Prometheus Holdings is some kind of activist investor," a young man named David said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The kind that comes in, fires half the staff, and flips the company for profit." "Is that what you heard?" Elena asked, her tone genuinely curious, and David nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased to be sharing insider information with the pregnant woman who'd been relegated to the back of the room. "Patricia Wellington is convinced they'll maintain the family legacy," a woman named Michelle added, glancing toward the head table where Patricia was laughing at something James had said. "She told the board that Wellington money built this company, and Wellington values will sustain it regardless of who's signing the checks." Elena absorbed this information, adding it to the catalog of assumptions she'd been collecting. But her attention was drawn to the front of the room where Patricia had risen from her seat and was approaching the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd never been contradicted in a public setting. The room quieted immediately. Patricia's reputation for memorable speeches had been earned through decades of perfectly timed observations and carefully targeted critiques that left audiences laughing while her victims bled. "Good evening, everyone," Patricia began, her voice carrying the warmth of a grandmother and the edge of a prosecutor. 43 years ago, my late husband and I started Wellington Industries with a simple belief that family legacy isn't just about building wealth, but about building character. We believe that the people we choose to stand beside us, our partners, our associates, our family members, reflect who we are and what we value. Elena felt her phone buzz with a message from Richard. "Legal team is in position. Security has the documents. Say the word and we execute." But she typed back, "Not yet. Let her finish." Patricia continued, warming to her theme. "Recently, our family has made some necessary changes. My son James has shown the courage to acknowledge when a relationship isn't serving his highest purpose, when a partnership is based on circumstance rather than genuine compatibility." The room had gone completely silent now, the implication clear enough that several guests glanced toward table 17, though most didn't know Elena well enough to recognize her. "And I'm proud to say that he's chosen to move forward with someone who truly embodies the Wellington standard, a woman of ambition, sophistication, and genuine partnership. Please join me in congratulating James and his fiancée, Vanessa Pierce." The applause was immediate and thunderous, exactly as Patricia had choreographed it. But Elena noticed something the others didn't. Vanessa's smile was slightly strained, as if she was suddenly aware that being celebrated for replacing someone carried its own uncomfortable implications about her own replaceability. James stood, pulling Vanessa to her feet, and the Wellington family pearls caught the light as she turned to acknowledge the crowd. Patricia beamed with satisfaction, having delivered her message about necessary changes and circumstance rather than compatibility with the surgical precision that had made her legendary. But then Patricia's eyes swept the room in a final gesture of triumph, and they landed on table 17, where Elena sat in her custom maternity gown, hands folded over her stomach. watching with an expression that Patricia initially interpreted as humiliation, but which was actually something far more dangerous. Patience that had finally reached its conclusion. "Oh," Patricia said into the microphone, her voice dripping with surprise that was equal parts genuine and performed. "I see we have an uninvited guest this evening. Elena, dear, I thought I made it clear that this event was for current family members and employees in good standing. Your table is quite far from the family section. Are you lost, or did you simply not understand the seating arrangements?" The room's energy shifted immediately, 300 guests turning to locate the target of Patricia's attention, some gasping at the cruelty, others leaning forward with the anticipation of witnesses to an execution. James's face paled as he realized what his mother was doing, but Vanessa's expression revealed something else. The sudden awareness that being part of the Wellington family meant participating in its cruelty, and that the woman wearing the family pearls might someday be the woman in the back of the room being humiliated. Elena stood slowly, her hands still resting on her pregnant stomach, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried perfectly in the shocked silence. "I'm not lost, Patricia. I'm exactly where I need to be. But I think there's been some confusion about who belongs at the family table." The silence in the Metropolitan Ballroom was the kind that preceded either violence or revelation. 300 people holding their breath as Elena Martinez walked slowly from table 17 toward the stage where Patricia Wellington stood with the microphone, her expression transforming from smug satisfaction to confused irritation, as the pregnant woman she'd just humiliated refused to crumble. James half rose from his seat, his hand reaching toward Elena, in a gesture that might have been protection or containment, but Vanessa pulled him back down with a grip on his arm that suggested she understood something catastrophic was unfolding and wanted him seated when it hit. "Patricia," Elena said, her voice still quiet but now amplified by the room's acoustics as she approached the stage. "You asked if I understood the seating arrangements. I do. Table 17 is traditionally for guests who aren't essential to the company's operations. Plus ones, minor stakeholders, people who are here by courtesy rather than right." She paused at the base of the stage stairs, one hand on the railing, the other still resting on her stomach. "But I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my relationship to Wellington Industries." Patricia's face hardened into the expression she used when dismissing subordinates who'd overstepped their bounds. "Elena, this is neither the time nor the place for whatever scene you're planning. You've embarrassed yourself and my son quite enough without adding public dramatics to, 'I own this company, Patricia.' 4 words, delivered without drama, without flourish, without the theatrical emphasis that might have made them seem like a bluff, but with the simple finality of someone stating an obvious fact that others had somehow missed. The silence that followed was different now, not anticipatory but stunned, as 300 people processed information that didn't align with anything they'd been told about the Prometheus Holdings acquisition. James stood again, this time with enough force to knock his chair backward. "That's ridiculous. Elena, you're upset, I understand, but making false claims at a company event isn't. Prometheus Holdings purchased 73% of Wellington Industries 6 weeks ago," Elena continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire ballroom. "The board recommended accepting the offer because the company was hemorrhaging money. 2 years of declining market share, failed expansions, and leadership too distracted by personal matters to notice the bleeding. Prometheus Holdings is a subsidiary of Martinez Global Enterprises, which is the umbrella corporation for my venture capital portfolio. I am Prometheus Holdings, James. I bought your family company while you were planning your wedding to Vanessa." Richard Chen appeared at the ballroom's entrance with 3 associates, each carrying leather folders that Elena recognized as the complete documentation of the acquisition. Every signature, every corporate filing, every proof that the woman Patricia had just mocked for not understanding seating arrangements was actually the person who determined that Patricia would be sitting anywhere at all. Patricia's face had gone from red to white, the microphone trembling in her hand. "That's impossible. We vetted the buyers. We reviewed their credentials. Prometheus Holdings is a carefully structured corporate entity designed to allow me to purchase Wellington Industries without triggering the personal vendetta clauses your lawyers built into the company bylaws. Elena finished, climbing the stairs to the stage now, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who'd planned this moment for months and wouldn't be rushed through its execution. You wrote those clauses 15 years ago, Patricia, after a business rival tried to buy the company out from under you. They prevent any individual or entity with demonstrated personal animosity toward the Wellington family from purchasing controlling shares. So I made sure that Prometheus Holdings had no obvious connection to Elena Martinez, the woman you've spent 7 years mocking at these parties. She reached the stage now, standing beside Patricia, and gestured to Richard, who approached with the primary folder. Elena opened it, displaying the ownership documents with her signature clearly visible, and handed it to Patricia with the same gentle courtesy Patricia had used when telling Elena she wasn't welcome at family events. "Every $10 bill James gave me," Elena said, her voice still measured but now carrying an edge that suggested the patience had fully transformed into power. "I documented every humiliation at these parties, every dismissive comment about my humble background, every time you told James he'd married beneath himself. I recorded it all. Not for revenge, Patricia, but for evidence. Evidence of character. Evidence that would help me understand exactly who I was dealing with when I decided whether to save this company or let it collapse under the weight of your family's arrogance." James had made it to the stage now, his face showing the dawning comprehension of someone watching their entire reality restructure itself. "Elena, if this is true, if you actually own the company, then why didn't you say something? Why let it get to this point?" And here was the moment Elena had been waiting for, the question that would let her explain not just what she'd done, but why she'd done it with such calculated precision. "Because I needed to know, James. I needed to know if the man who gave his pregnant wife $10 a day while planning a wedding to his mistress was capable of recognizing what he'd lost. I needed to know if your mother would show mercy if she thought I was powerless, or if her cruelty was fundamental to who she is. And I needed to know if Vanessa would stand by you when the money disappeared." She turned to face the ballroom, addressing all 300 guests who were now witnesses to a reversal that would be discussed in business schools and divorce proceedings for years to come. "As of tomorrow morning, Wellington Industries will undergo restructuring. Patricia Wellington's advisory role is terminated immediately. James Wellington will remain as CEO conditionally. He'll receive the same $10 per day he gave me, and we'll see if he can manage a company while experiencing the dignity and respect he showed his pregnant wife. And Vanessa Pierce's consulting contract is canceled, effective now." Vanessa had already stood and was moving toward the exit, her survival instincts sharp enough to recognize when a ship was sinking, the Wellington family pearls still around her neck, but her connection to the man who'd given them already severed. James watched her go with the expression of someone understanding for the first time that partnership based on ambition rather than character evaporates the moment the ambition can't be fed. But it was Patricia's face that revealed the true devastation, the shattering of a worldview built over 4 decades, the recognition that the woman she tormented had been strategically superior all along, and the crushing awareness that every moment of cruelty had been observed, documented, and ultimately weaponized by someone playing a longer game than Patricia had imagined possible. "You've crushed us," Patricia whispered, the microphone picking up words that weren't meant to be public but were now broadcast to the entire room. "You've destroyed everything we built." Elena's hand moved to her stomach again, feeling the baby kick with what seemed like perfect timing. "No, Patricia, you destroyed it. I just documented the destruction and decided whether to save what remained. And I've decided that some legacies, the ones built on cruelty and maintained through humiliation, deserve to end so better ones can begin." She walked off the stage, leaving the microphone, the documents, and the shattered Wellington family behind, heading not toward table 17, but toward the exit where Richard waited with the car that would take her back to the apartment James had thought was adequate for her circumstances. Behind her, James Wellington stood frozen between his mother and the exit where his mistress had fled, finally comprehending the magnitude of trading his pregnant wife for $10 a day. The man who'd believed himself generous had discovered he'd actually been catastrophically blind, and the crushing weight of that knowledge, that he'd kicked out the only person who could have saved him, would follow him for the rest of his life, a ghost that no amount of money or redemption could ever fully exorcise. In the ballroom, 300 witnesses sat in stunned silence, having watched poetic justice unfold with the precision of a master strategist who transformed patience into power and humiliation into triumph. The Wellington Industries Spring Gala would be remembered, but not for the reasons Patricia had intended. It would be remembered as the night when quiet strength defeated loud arrogance, when documented evidence crushed assumed superiority, and when the woman in the maternity dress revealed she'd been the most powerful person in the room all along. Elena Martinez stepped into the night air, placing both hands on her stomach where her child grew. A child who would inherit not the Wellington name, but the lesson that character, patience, and strategic thinking were worth more than all the family pearls and company parties in the world. The gala continued behind her, but without the family it was meant to celebrate, and with a new understanding that underestimating quiet people was the most expensive mistake wealth could buy. 6 months after the gala that ended the Wellington dynasty, Elena Martinez stood in the newly renovated headquarters of what was now officially Martinez Wellington Industries, holding her 3-month-old daughter against her shoulder while reviewing the quarterly reports that showed the company's first profitable quarter in 3 years. The baby, Sofia Elena Martinez, had been born exactly 2 weeks after the gala, as if she'd been waiting for her mother to finish one chapter before beginning another, and Elena had spent her maternity leave restructuring a company while learning to function on 2 hours of sleep, discovering that both tasks required similar levels of strategic patience and tolerance for chaos. The $10 bills, all 97 of them that James had given her during those final months, were now framed on her office wall, mounted under glass with a small plaque that read, "Evidence of Character, a reminder that value and worth are determined by how we treat people when we believe they have no power to affect us." The frame had become something of a legend in business circles, featured in Forbes and Harvard Business Review articles about strategic patience and the long game of professional vindication. But for Elena, it remained something more personal. A reminder that she'd been tested and had responded not with immediate retaliation, but with documented precision. James Wellington worked 3 floors below her now, having accepted the conditional CEO position with the kind of humility that comes only from complete devastation. He earned his $10 per day for the first month. Elena had been serious about that consequence, but had eventually been restored to a modest salary once he demonstrated genuine change in how he treated every employee from custodial staff to senior executives. He would never be wealthy again in the way he'd once been, the divorce settlement having been particularly ungenerous given the documentation of his affair and abandonment. But Elena had noticed something unexpected. He seemed lighter now, as if the weight of pretending to be generous while being cruel had been heavier than the burden of actually becoming the person he'd once claimed to be. Vanessa Pierce had moved to California and married a tech entrepreneur. The Wellington family pearls returned via registered mail with no note attached, though Elena had heard through professional networks that Vanessa now advocated for women in business to maintain their own financial independence regardless of their partner's wealth. A lesson apparently learned from watching everything collapse when she'd built her security on someone else's foundation. Patricia Wellington had disappeared from public life entirely. The woman who'd spent 4 decades as a social architect now living in a modest condo in Florida. Her legendary cruelty finally silenced by the recognition that the weapons she'd used against others had ultimately destroyed only herself. Elena had sent her a card when Sofia was born, not out of obligation, but out of the genuine hope that Patricia might learn something from becoming a grandmother she'd never be allowed to know, though no response had ever arrived. The company itself had transformed under Elena's leadership. The culture of cruelty and hierarchy replaced with something that actually resembled the family values Patricia had always claimed to champion, but never practiced. Employee satisfaction had tripled, innovation had returned, and the Wellington name, now hyphenated with Martinez, represented not legacy and entitlement, but redemption and second chances for organizations willing to examine their character honestly. Elena stood at her office window, Sofia sleeping against her shoulder. looking out at the city where she'd been dismissed as a woman who trapped a billionaire with pregnancy, but had actually been a trillionaire, documenting evidence for the case that would change her life. She thought about the journey from those $10 bills to this moment, about how patience and preparation had defeated arrogance and assumption, and about how the baby in her arms would grow up knowing that her mother had been underestimated and had transformed that underestimation into power, not through anger but through strategic, documented, undeniable proof of character. On her desk sat a letter from James, the 47th he'd written since the gala, none of which asked for forgiveness, because he'd finally learned that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand or deserve, but all of which documented his attempt to become someone worthy of his daughter's future respect, if not his ex-wife's current mercy. Elena hadn't responded to most of them, but she kept them in a folder labeled Evidence of Growth, because she'd learned that documentation worked both ways. It could record failures that destroyed empires, but it could also record changes that rebuilt character. The $10 bills on her wall caught the afternoon light, transforming from evidence of humiliation into proof that the most expensive mistakes were always the ones that cost nothing at the time, but everything in the end, and that the most valuable investments were always the ones that required patience to mature, but yielded returns that lasted forever. Sophia stirred against her shoulder, and Elena whispered the words she would repeat throughout her daughter's life. Remember, baby girl, your worth is never determined by how others value you, but by how you value yourself enough to document the truth and wait for the right moment to reveal it. Outside her window, the city continued its endless motion, full of people making choices about character and consequence, about patience and power, about whether to give someone $10 and believe themselves generous or to recognize that true generosity, like true strength, was measured not in what we gave when we had everything, but in who we became when we had nothing left but our character to sustain us. The Wellington Martinez legacy would continue, but it would be written by a woman who'd counted $10 bills not because she needed them, but because she'd understood that documentation was destiny, and that the person patient enough to gather evidence was always more powerful than the person arrogant enough to create it.